Hello and welcome to this week's episode of The Cat Who Project, a podcast where we take a deep dive into Lillian Jackson Braun's world of Qwill and Coco. In today's episode, we are going to have a look at two of the supporting female characters in The Cat Who Could Read Backwards, Sandy and Zoe. I wanted to take a closer look at Sandy and Zoe because Qwill is a little flirtatious with them, which I think is really fun. In the later books, we know that Qwill enjoys his relationship with Polly, who's around the same age as him, and they have a very relaxed and comfortable connection. But in this first book, it was quite surprising to see Qwill not only appreciate the good looks of a couple of ladies, but also become quite smitten by one of them. Qwill first meets Sandy Hallapay at the Valentine's Ball. Sandy is the wife of Cal Hallapay, the boy-like artist who Qwill interviews in his first days with the Daily Flux. Cal is actually the chairman of the Valentine's Ball, which is being held at the Turp and Chisel Club. This club sounds amazing and was once the backroom of a blind pig. Now, if you don't know what a blind pig is, and I certainly didn't, it is an American term for a place that sold illegal alcohol during the Prohibition. But 40 years on, the Turp and Chisel is an upmarket and glamorous bar, lounge, games room, and ballroom. Sandy is described as exotic-looking, very beautiful, and with almond-shaped eyes. Earlier in Chapter 1, Odd Bunsen describes Sandy as Carl's sharp-looking wife and guesses her measurements as 34, 22, 32. Qwill is attending the Valentine's Ball because he needs to submit copy about the ball for the paper later in the evening. When he arrives, he asks for the Hallapay table and finds Sandy. She is looking gorgeous, dressed in a white kimono of stiff embroidered silk. They shake hands and Sandy holds Qwill's hand far longer than she needs to. She is definitely flirting with him and he's enjoying it because he flirts right back. The passage reads, "He surprised himself by bending over her hand and brushing it with his moustache." He then goes on to ask Sandy to dance. I can't recall Qwill dancing in later books, but I might be wrong. But it seems that Qwill is quite the expert at both the foxtrot and the cha-cha-cha. Qwill recognises Sandy as a valuable asset early on in terms of information. She knows the art scene and she's married to the man Qwill is supposed to be writing an article on. As they dance, Qwill questions her about some of the other artists' attendees, and Sandy obliges with some blunt and rather robust opinions of each. Qwill points out the art writer from the rival newspaper and asks Sandy if she's an art expert. Sandy replies saying that her husband was a camouflage artist in World War I and that this supposedly makes her an art expert. She describes the sculptures of Mr. Riggs as stringy, emaciated things that look like grasshoppers. She says the Butchwalters always dress like peasants and that Mrs. Butchwalter is an egghead. She describes the costume Butchie Bolton welded for herself as looking like two truck fenders. And she, of course, detests Monk Clemens for all the negative reviews he writes about her husband. Sandy is loud, forward, gregarious, and fun-loving. She loves attention and she gets it. This is evident when Qwill takes her out to lunch. Qwill was at a loss as to where to take a woman like Sandy. He asks Arch and inquires if the Flux would cover the bill. Arch tells Qwill to ask the hungry photographers, as they are always getting people to buy lunch on expense accounts. Qwill goes to the photo lab and finds 6 pairs of feet propped up on the desk waiting for the prints to come off the dryer. They suggest the Sitting Bull's Chop House in unison, good helpings they say, but you'll have to compete with the cigar smoke. On the day of his lunch appointment with Sandy, Qwill selects his tie, one that Sandy might approve of. He chooses a navy and green wool tartan tie made in Scotland. When Qwill and Sandy arrive at the Sitting Bull's chop house, Sandy is delighted. She says, "Oh, what a fun place. How clever of you to bring me here. So many men, and I adore men." Sandy was indeed the centre of attention, wearing a red hat topped with a proud rooster's tail feather. She orders oysters, which of course were not on the menu, but she was happy with a glass of champagne, and with each sip, Sandy's laughter became more shrill. The lunch was not a success. Sandy had not brought the information and the photographs that Qwill had needed for his article on her husband, Cal, and her loud and flamboyant manner soon wore on the nerves of both Qwill and the other diners. Although very attractive, Sandy's shrill voice becomes her key characteristic and is in complete contrast to the other key female that Qwill becomes enamoured with. He first hears Zoe Lambeth's voice at the Valentine's ball, just as he's about to leave. Her voice is soft and low. "Aren't you the new man for the Daily Fluxion?" And this is the first time we get introduced to this trait of Qwill's that runs through the whole series. The text reads, "When he hears Zoe's voice, his moustache tingled." It goes on to say that women's voices sometimes affected him this way, and that this voice was like caressing fingers. And we know from later Cat Who books that one of the things that Qwill finds so attractive about Polly is her voice. Zoe is the complete opposite to Sandy in many ways, not just her voice. Where Sandy loves to be the centre of attention, Zoe is demure and has a sense of fragility about her. She is described as warm and womanly with well-shaped lips. Qwill has, on more than one occasion, drowned in her large brown eyes. Zoe is a talented artist in her own right and is married to Earl Lambeth, the owner of the Lambeth Gallery. She paints mostly in the modern style, but she has also painted a portrait of her husband Earl and several very lifelike portraits of Coco. She is one of the few people that Montclemens gives favourable reviews of, and we also find out later that she's been having an affair with him. Zoe is also appalled when Qwill tells her that Sandy has offered to coach him in the art world. She says that much of the work being produced today is in the name of art. It's spurrilous at its worst and shoddy at its best, and goes on to tell Qwill that he should insist on knowing the credentials of his advisors. When Zoe's husband Earl is murdered, she becomes even more delicate, and people seem to want to protect her, Qwill being one of them. But as he continues his investigations into the murder of Earl Lambeth and later Montclemens, there is a part of him that questions Zoe's innocence. In Chapter 8, Qwill is talking to Odd Bunsen about Zoe. Odd calls her that Zoe doll and says she doesn't seem to be taking her husband's death too hard. Qwill replies saying, "Zoe is a calm, intelligent woman, even if she is a doll," and defends Zoe by saying that she's not the type to collapse. Odd says that if his wife ever finds him in a pool of blood, that he wants her to collapse and collapse good. He says, "I don't want her running home and fixing her lipstick and putting on a sharp outfit to receive callers." Qwill gives Zoe the benefit of the doubt and says that she's in shock. At the end of Chapter 8, Zoe calls Qwill and says she needs to talk. Qwill suggests the press club, but Zoe insists on somewhere more private, and she does agree to his suggestion of coming to his apartment the following afternoon. Qwill is delighted, and his inner newspaperman forms an imaginary but very desirable headline. "Widow of slain art dealer reveals story to Flux reporter." But is also quite nervous because he hasn't entertained for a long time. As he drinks his instant coffee and finishes off a stale donut, he wonders what to serve Zoe when she visits. I love this part because Qwill is really flustered. he ends up walking 6 blocks in horrible February weather to find the nearest bakery. After some indecisiveness, he chooses some chocolate chip cookies. Back home, he realizes he has no sugar, cream, or paper napkins, so he goes back out to buy some. Back home again, and he realizes he has no cigarettes to offer Zoe, so he heads back out for a 3rd time to the drugstore. Further indecision, and he decides on non-filter because he thinks Zoe is not one to compromise. He also notices for the first time how dusty his apartment is. There's lint on the carpet and cat hair everywhere. He vacuums and then has the gas log fire lit so that the apartment is warm for Zoe. He's ready by 1:30, hours before Zoe is even due to arrive. Everything about Zoe is soft and vulnerable. She's wearing a soft brown coat and underneath that a pale blue dress of fuzzy wool that makes her look even more fragile. She says she had to sneak out of the house away from the watchful eye of Butchie to come to Qwill's apartment, and she feels like she might have been followed. Qwill takes her coat and Zoe sits down on the straight-backed pull-up chair and crossed her knees attractively. Yes, her knees. A few sentences on, Qwill tries not to stare at the provocative indentation just below her kneecap. Qwill's earlier efforts were in vain, even though he was the perfect host. Zoe simply couldn't relax, and as he offered her a cookie, coffee and cigarettes, she only turned each one down, saying that she was counting calories and had given up smoking. She even mentioned that the room was rather warm and Qwill moved to turn down the gas heater. When she leaves, Qwill realizes he's left with a can of coffee, a pound of sugar, half a pint of cream, a pack of cigarettes, and 2 pounds of chocolate chip cookies. And although their conversation gave way to quite a lot of information, Qwill was also left wondering what she held back. Zoe is an artist in her own right, and during this conversation, I found it interesting how she responds when Qwill asks her why she paints such incomprehensible things when she clearly has the ability to make real pictures of real things. We learned earlier on that her work is shown in the Lambeth Gallery, and Qwill noticed one in the window when he visits the Lambeth Gallery in Chapter 4. One painting was navy blue sprinkled with black and purple, while the other was a mysterious gravy of thick paint in tired browns and purples. When Qwill looked at the painting more closely, an image seemed to emerge, a pair of eyes, whose expression seemed to change from innocence to savagery. I think this is quite interesting because as the book progresses, Qwill's opinion of Zoe tends to ebb between thinking of her as a delicate woman who needs protecting to suspecting her of murder. But in the end, Zoe is not a murderer and Qwill is completely smitten with her. At one stage, when he is attending the happening, the thought crosses Qwill's mind about how long it would be before he could conventionally invite her out to dinner. He thinks that a widow who didn't believe in funerals and who wore purple silk trousers as mourning attire apparently didn't cling to convention. And at the end of the book, Qwill does indeed have a dinner date planned with Zoe that he is very much looking forward to. Is Zoe in book 2? I can't quite remember. Well, that's it for this week, Cat Who friends. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Cat Who Project. My name is Rohan, and we shall talk again soon.